Wait, go back down. What does that cat look like?
It looks like Venus.
Holy shit!
Is that porch cat?
It looks like
It looks exactly like the porch cat that...
That's the cat that keeps showing up on our porch.
Yes!
That is so creepy.
That is... Whoa, dude!
You left
When
that
I
door
picked
open.
it up, it was over here.
Nah, never mind. I don't want to die. Instead, I'm just going to say, wow, that's very interesting. I don't know what the question is. I'm afraid to ask this question because I don't want to die. I mean, what is the question? Is just like if you're in the middle of like the Oscars or anything like that, and you say it's just like, hey, does anyone ever notice that Jeffrey Epstein was friends with a lot of people who go to this, who are like currently attending this gala? Next thing you know, it's just like you wind up missing, or you wind up in a car accident. You wind up getting they wind up, making it look like an accident. Mm-hmm. I'm convinced that there are people out there who tried to expose the truth about what's really going on and just they got dealt with. That sucks. It really does, because it's just like, damn it. Does this really have to be the way things are? Apparently. Yeah, apparently. But Mr. Ballin has a video for us. It says, never ask this question unless you want to die. I want to know what the question is, but I don't want to ask it. That's the thing. Knowing the question and asking the question are two completely different things. I just want to know it. I guess let's check out what Mr. Ballin has to say. Here we go.
Sailors are known to have lots of strange customs while out at sea. Like, some sailors believe that bananas are bad luck and so will not bring them on board their vessel, while other sailors believe it's good luck to throw one of their crew members overboard and then reel him back in before beginning a fishing trip, that somehow that will enhance your chances of catching more fish. But while a lot of these customs of the sea are pretty harmless and kind of goofy, there's one custom of the sea that is not at all. It is extremely serious and very, very dark. It's known simply as the delicate question, and in short, once a sailor asks this delicate question under certain circumstances, there's no going back for that crew. And today, we're going to learn about one of the most famous examples of this custom being carried out in real life. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please go through all the Like Button's social media posts and correct their spelling and grammar in the comments section. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story.
Survivor's Guild.
On the morning of February 6th, 1821, 4 young men stood on the deck of a small boat out in the Pacific Ocean. The sun was out, it was beautiful and warm, the water was crystal blue, but none of these 4 men were paying any attention to their surroundings. Instead, all of them were just standing there in total silence, staring at each other. Finally, one of the 4 men spoke up. His name was Owen Coffin, and he was 18 years old. And Owen, like the other 3 men, had grown up on the water. In fact, all 4 of these men had grown up on this small island called Nantucket, off the coast of Massachusetts, where the main industry there was whaling, which meant sailors...
Careful. I'm joking, I don't care.
Like these 4 men...
I can't actually remember how the rest of it goes.
Damn it, I'm curious now.
Oh man, from Nantucket.
There you are. There once was a man from Nantucket who kept all of his cash in a bucket, but his daughter named Nan ran away with a man And as for the bucket, Nan took it. That's pretty good. I know that there's other versions. It's just like there once was a
I think
man.
the implication is you're gonna say something like "fuck it."
Fuck it, yeah. I know that freaking Alex Hirsch had to argue with the Disney censors for the William Shakespeare's head, basically saying there once was a man from Kentucky. Yeah, just like, can you give me a limerick? And he's like, there once was a man from Kentucky. She's like, nope. Throws his head into the fire. And it's just like, they were just like, we want you to redact that line or change it to something else. It's just like, it makes no sense why you would want me to change it. What's he gonna say? It's like, there once was a man from Kentucky who loved to play with his rubber ducky. Like what? And then they approved it eventually.
And slaughter them for their oil. So, from the time Owen and the rest of these men were very little, they were out on the water learning how to sail, and they were also learning the customs of the sea. And there was one custom in particular that Owen wanted to talk about right now with the other three men. So, in a very serious and hushed tone, Owen asked the question of the other three men that sailors referred to as the delicate question. And after Owen asked the so-called delicate question, the other three men, who were already very serious and just kind of standing there in silence, suddenly their eyes started to go wide and their mouths went agape. And then again, all of the men just kind of fell into total silence. The only sound they could hear was the splashing of the waves against the side of the boat. The captain of this vessel was a man named George Pollard. He was 28 years old, and he was actually Owen's older cousin. And what George wanted to say to Owen in response to his delicate question was no. But George didn't say that. Instead, he just put his hands up over his mouth and stared kind of incredulously at Owen and the other two men who were also teenagers. Their names were George and Barzillai. And as he stared at these other three men, he realized that their answers to the delicate question was a resounding yes. They knew it had to be a yes. They had to do this. And even though George could totally override them because he was the captain and so technically in charge, he knew in this situation, under this particular custom, he couldn't overrule them. And so, with his hands still over his mouth, George just nodded a yes. Yes, let's go forward with this custom. And so, with a unanimous decision to move forward, Owen slowly reached down and pulled out the ship's logbook from underneath one of the seats behind him. And then he opened up the book and he flipped to the back pages of the logbook, which were totally blank, and he grabbed one of the pieces of paper and he ripped it out of the book. Then Owen began to rip this piece of paper into strips. First, he ripped 3 identically long pieces of paper, and he held up all 3 at the same time to show the others that these are the 3 that are the same. And each of the 3 nodded their head, yes, we see that. And then Owen reached down, he grabbed the paper again, and he ripped a 4th strip out, and this one was dramatically shorter than the other 3. And so Owen held up this much shorter piece, and he showed Charles, George, and Barzillai, and again, they all kind of nodded in agreement, yes, we see, that's the short piece. And so once the whole group was satisfied that they had their 4 strips, Owen took off his hat, he put all 4 of the strips inside, mixed it around.
They're drawing for the shortest one.
It was
for
time.
something.
The first man to reach into Owen's hat.
The fuck was that?
I don't know.
Weird.
Was Owen's older cousin and the captain, George. He reached in, he pulled one of the strips of paper out, closed it in his fist so he had no idea which one it was, and pulled it back and held it close to his chest. And then one by one, each of the other men did the same thing, reaching in, grabbing their strip, not looking at it, and holding it against their chest. And then once all the strips had been taken, at the exact same time, all 4 men extended their hands into the middle of the circle they were standing in, and they opened their hands palm up to reveal which strip they got. And George, Charles, and Barzillai all had the identical long pieces, And Owen, the 18-year-old, the younger cousin of the captain, the one who had ripped up the strips, he had the short strip. And immediately when his older cousin, George, saw this, he yelled out, "No, let me take that one." But Owen said, "No, this is customary. I want this." And so after a few moments of the men kind of collecting themselves and calming down, Charles then grabbed the logbook again, flipped to the back of it, pulled out another blank page, and he ripped it into strips again, except now he was only ripping them into 3 strips, 2 long that were identical and 1 short. And once again, as he ripped them, he held them up to show the other men, to show this was a fair process. Then Charles took off his hat, put the 3 strips inside, and extended it to George and Barzillai. Owen was not a part of this round. And so George and Barzillai, one by one, reached in, took their strip, held it to their chest, and then Charles, he would take the last strip, he would hold it to his chest, and then once all the men had their pieces, they held their hands out into the middle of their now smaller circle, they opened their hands, palm up, and this time it would be Charles, the man who ripped up this second round, who would discover he had the short strip. And as soon as Charles saw this, he threw it on the ground and he ran to the other side of the boat and began screaming, "I can't do this! I can't do it!" Meanwhile, Owen, George, and Barzillai didn't even move or flinch. They just stood there waiting for Charles to calm down, because they knew he knew this was a very important custom, and once you begin doing it, you can't just stop. Charles would have to come back over and play his role. And so after a few minutes of Charles still kind of calling out that he couldn't do this, tears are coming down his face, he finally wiped the tears, he calmed himself down, and he walked back over to the group, who again, they hadn't moved. George, Barzillai, and Owen, they're just standing there waiting to continue this custom. And so as Charles began coming back over, looking ready to continue, George, without even saying anything, reached down and unlatched a door on the side of the boat. He opened it up, he reached in, and he pulled out this long object that was wrapped in canvas. And then he handed this object to Charles. And then once Charles had possession of this object, Owen, the man who had first drawn the short piece of paper, said to the group, "Now it's time for a moment of silence," even though at this point none of the men were talking. But still, they formed a tight circle with Charles holding this object, and they all bowed their heads, and they just stood there in total silence. And then, once Owen raised his head, the other 3 did as well, and Owen, one by one, touched the shoulders of each of the men and reminded them that this had been a fair process. Then, without saying another word, Owen turned away from the group. He walked over to the edge of the boat, looking out over the water. He got down on his knees. He made sure his posture was good, and he looked out over the water. Owen had always loved the ocean, even though his own father had died out at sea. But this particular whaling expedition that Owen had been on, he thought went extremely well, and he was very proud of what they had all accomplished. And Owen was especially proud to be a part of this particular custom. This custom was one that so few people ever took part in, but all sailors knew about it. It was kind of like the forbidden custom. And here he was playing a central role, which really required a lot of strength. And so, feeling very proud of himself, Owen, after looking out over the water for a few more moments, he bent down and put his chin on the edge of the boat, which signaled to Charles it was time. And then once Charles saw that Owen was in position, he stepped away from George and Barzillai and walked over to Owen, carrying this object wrapped in canvas. And then once he was right behind Owen,
that or like a bludgeoning object, I don't know.
Without saying a word to him, he unwrapped the object, and it was a rifle. And once the rifle was uncovered, he placed the barrel against the back of Owen's head, and then he fired a shot. And instantly, Owen slumped to the ground, dead, and Charles kind of staggered back and fell on the deck and let out this strangled scream. He couldn't believe what he had just done, but he knew there was no other choice. Once they decided to do this sacred custom, they had to take it to the end. And so George, who had just witnessed the execution of his younger cousin, was deeply troubled and pained, but he too knew they had to bring this custom to the finish line, which meant it was George's turn to step forward and play his part. And so George walked up to his now dead younger cousin, and George pulled out a serrated knife and cut off Owen's head. And then once Owen's head was removed, he placed it on the deck, so Owen's face was looking away from the other men, like he couldn't see what they were going to do. And then once the head was in place, George went back to Owen's body and began cutting him open and pulling his organs out and handing them to Charles and Barzillai.
What?
George also began cutting off long strips of Owen's flesh, creating sort of like fillets. And then, even though there was a spot on the boat to have a fire, the three men decided they just could not wait. And before long, the only sound that could be heard on board this little boat floating out at sea on the Pacific Ocean was the sound of Charles.
What?
That they're eating him.
Charles, George, and Barzillai tearing into Owen's raw flesh with their teeth, turning their beards bright red with his blood. The delicate question that Owen asked the other men at the beginning of this story was one of the most feared questions amongst sailors. And it was only asked if there was a shipwreck or some sort of emergency that happened out at sea, which meant the group had almost no chance of survival. Only in those circumstances was the delicate question appropriate. And what it was, do we draw lots to determine which one of us dies so the other can eat them in order to have a better chance at survival?
Jesus.
And so during that first round, when Owen had drawn the short strip of paper, that determined he would be the one who was murdered and eaten. And then in the second round, when Charles drew the short strip of paper, that meant he would be the one to kill Owen. On February 6th, 1821, the day that Owen posed the delicate question, he and the other three men had been lost at sea for the past 3 months after a whale had struck the side of their whaling boat and left them adrift with almost no food and no water. There had been other men on board the Essex who had died from starvation and exposure, and their bodies had been consumed by the surviving sailors until on February 6th, they were down to just these 4 men and no more bodies to eat, which is why they decided it was time. They had to ask the delicate question. 17 days after Owen sacrificed himself so the others could eat him, another boat happened to drift past the stranded Essex boat, which now only contained Charles and George. Barzillai had died of starvation 5 days after they killed Owen, and Barzillai had been eaten by George and Charles as well. And as this other ship passed by the Essex and they looked on board, all they saw were skeletons of the men that had died and been eaten, and Charles and George were on opposite ends of the boat, curled up in a ball, chewing on human finger bones, trying to get the last bits of flesh off. And their bodies were totally emaciated, their hair and their beards were wild, they looked totally feral. And then when this boat actually came up alongside the Essex and boarded to rescue Charles and George looked terrified. It was like they had totally lost their grip on reality. They had been lost at sea for 94 days and had consumed all of their friends, and so it makes sense they might go kind of crazy. But after this crew was able to get Charles and George fed and get them water and cleaned up, they kind of regained their composure and their sanity, and they were very thankful and happy to be alive. The story of what happened to the crew of the Essex quickly spread all around the world, and in fact, it served as inspiration for Herman Melville to write his classic American novel, Moby Dick.
Yeah.
On March 22nd, 1994, 4 people were sitting in a circle inside of a dark hotel room in England. In front of them was a homemade Ouija board. The 4 people in the hotel room reached out 1 finger each and placed that finger on a glass cup that was flipped upside down, resting in the middle of this Ouija board. After looking around at each other nervously, one of the 4 people began to speak out loud. They asked the room if there were any spirits with them right now, and nothing happened. The 4 people started to laugh at themselves for even trying to do this, when suddenly the glass cup began to move. As the 4 people stared at each other, trying to figure out if one of them was moving the cup on purpose, the glass cup slid all the way to the corner of the board and came to a stop over the word yes. This Ouija board session would not only become one of the most famous Ouija board sessions of all time, but also it would have a dramatic impact on a major criminal case.
Okay.
So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story and you want to hear more like it, be sure to check out our podcast called the Mr. Ballin Podcast, which is available exclusively on Amazon Music. There is a link to the podcast in the description below.
All right. So yeah, damn.
So it's never asked this question unless you want to die, but it seems like if you're in a situation to ask that question, it's either ask that question
Or you
die.
will die.
Yeah.
This is why I'm afraid of like going out to see. Well, I know it's not going to be as common nowadays because there's transponders, GPS tracking, all these things that make it to where being lost at sea won't really be as much of a factor. But still, there is the fear that I have, and honestly, I wouldn't know what to do at that point. Terrifying like scenario. Sheesh. But I mean honestly, that stuff right there, man. Like that's the stuff that it's the shit that nightmares are made of. I mean, what else is there to say about that story except I guess I'm glad I wasn't a sailor back in the day. I guess I'm glad that you don't hear about stuff like that more often than not.
Yeah.
Also, the fact that that's the basis for Moby Dick, I think, is one of the best things ever, because it's just like shit. It's like a hell of a thing to be inspired by.
Yeah.
Well, it's just like Ed Gein is the biggest inspiration behind like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and that's pretty terrifying.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, this never ask this question unless you want to die. Fitting, very fitting, and honestly, I wouldn't know what to do in that scenario. I'd probably just wind up saying, "All right. Make it quick," and then I'm a big guy, so I guess I would supply a lot of sustenance for people. That's a joke, by the way.
Just hope I'm never in a situation like that.
Yeah, I hope I'm never in a situation like that. Anyway, that's gonna do it. So this was Mr. Ballin. If you want to see more from him, click his name in the title of the video. And until next time, I'm Nate.
I am Nick.
Y'all be good people. We'll see you in the next one. Peace.